So let me just go through and quickly introduce the panel that we put together here, that Mike's put together. Mike Ward will be the moderator. Again, he's the director of content with Informa. Maury Ruffin is the managing director of ARM, just here to my left. We have Sarah Hacker-Meeks, who's with Adjuvant Partners. We've got Mike Werner, also from ARM. He's executive director. And on the end there is Tom Novak from Cellular Dynamics. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Ward.
Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this panel. We're at Informa. It's a big organization, and we're partners, or we're cousins of Bioprocess International, and we thought it'd be kind of interesting to actually almost do kind of like a live interview in front of an audience. So we brought this panel together to talk about an area which is, in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, is probably one of the hottest spaces. It's getting a lot of attraction in the media, in the sort of general media, and also a lot of attraction from the investment community. So we've seen a great number of companies who are in a space, or in this space, actually raising millions, if not tens of millions of pounds, to develop a technology which actually has been around. Gene therapy and cell therapy, it's been around for a long time. I remember 2 decades ago, sort of writing about companies like Sandoz and Rhone-Poulenc, who no longer exist. Rhone-Poulenc's now Sanofi and Sandoz is now Novartis, but spending hundreds of millions of dollars to get into the gene therapy space. Everybody was excited, and it's taken 2 decades for us to get back there. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of get this panel together to actually discuss, well, okay, what is different now? Okay, what are the sort of the challenges that the industry has managed to get over, and actually what are the challenges it now faces, whether they're technical, whether they're commercial, whether they're regulatory. And I think we've got a panel here that's going to be able to put that together. So if we could sort of start and kick off, what is different in 2016 from where we were in 1996 when we saw people like Sandoz spending $500 million to get into the gene therapy space? Who would like to kick it off? Tom, would you like to have a go first?
We're not a gene therapy company.
Right.
Our focus is on cell therapy, so I'll defer to my colleagues.
All right, Maury's going to kick it off then.
So I think there are a number of things that are different today than, say, 20 years ago, as you were referring to. I think one of the things, and we can talk about this both in the context of gene and cell therapy, but also tissue engineering, is, I think we've made a lot more progress with the science and the technology itself, addressing issues of safety, issues of scalability, really thinking about how we can make a business out of these technologies. And I think, and we can get into some of the detail, and I'll have Sarah address some of this with respect to gene therapy. We're really figuring out, how we are able to express effectively, how we can deliver the genes, and really seeing the evidence of this both in the preclinical models and now in the clinic of this technology actually working. So there's a lot of work that went into that over the last 20 years to get us to that point where we are today. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen so much interest in this sector. So yes, as you said, Mike, it has attracted a lot of capital, and that's because I think a lot of the people believe we've overcome some of those really difficult early technological challenges, and now we're really trying to understand how we can make this into a business. And there are certainly a number of regulatory issues still that we have to address, as well as issues of market access and reimbursement. I think we can talk about these during the panel as well. Sarah, you want to?
So I was going to say, before I comment, Tom, do you want to comment from the cell therapy perspective on cell companies?
Yeah, I think one of the, I don't know if people can hear me, one of the major improvements or changes over the last 20 years, I think, is obviously the development of induced pluripotent stem cells, the ability to use stem cells both for drug discovery and potentially therapeutics. So that brings some market and some income and revenue to companies who want to ultimately move into the cell therapy market. There's sort of an intermediate pathway where one can build the business and build their expertise. And that was, I think, a bit more difficult with embryonic stem cells, simply because there was, and always will be, I think, a bit of a political football, which makes investment more challenging and makes companies, I think, a little more leery about using those cells. They don't want to upset their investors or customers. So I think the development of reprogramming has gone a long way towards assuaging those concerns. And as Maury said, we've learned a lot more about safety. A lot of people have been treated with stem cells over the last 2 decades, not in any one large trial, but in a lot of small trials, and so far they seem to be safe regardless of their source, or regardless of what they've been differentiated into. So I think that's building some comfort that was missing years ago.
Right. And then
I'll just add, with regard to gene therapy technology, as Maury was saying, so let's say first generation AAV vectors that were discovered and began to be worked with 15 years ago, went through a series of sort of expansion into the academics translational centers, which enabled a number of different types of researchers to work on these, publish with them different disease types, different modes of delivery, different expression cassettes within them, and now sort of version 2.0 of those. There's been enough work done in the academic centers to sort of provide that body of evidence that these vectors are safe and now becoming efficacious to move them toward commercial development.
Right. And then tissue engineering. So what's the situation there? Compared with sort of cell therapy and gene therapy.
Tissues are typically scaffolds and cells, and so the fact that we can now make a lot of different cell types very efficiently, reproducibly, and economically, combined with advancements in material science, make it an obvious area of investment and excitement. You can now combine the two in a way that was more difficult to do in the past.
Right.
Yeah.
And I want to say that I think it's also all connected with the regulatory process, because when Sarah was talking about all of the publications that have been done and all of the literature that's out there and all of the work that's been done, that's what the FDA reviewers look at when they're evaluating new technologies and new products. So sometimes when you have new technologies, there needs to be this sort of body of literature out there about how the genes or cells are characterized and their safety profiles and all of those things, because that gives the regulatory agency, in this case the FDA in the US, the comfort to know about how these materials are going to behave. And so then they have confidence, the programs can proceed, and then it just sort of builds on itself.
Right. So the regulatory issues. I mean, whether they're ethical or whether it's the safety, the components, is clearly important. How close are we to actually having resolution? I mean, Tom mentioned the fact that there are some places with embryonic stem cells, it's still very, very difficult to have progress. So where are we? When it comes to sort of the policy and regulatory challenges, are they resolved yet? Or what do we need to do to resolve them?
Yeah. Well, I think what's happened is they've shifted, right? So I think some of the basic regulatory issues around the field of cell and gene therapy or tissue engineering, I think many of those have been somewhat resolved as the field advances, regulatory agencies feel more confident, there's more science, there's more literature, et cetera. But I think there's always going to be challenges as the technology gets more complex, number one. And number two, what I think we're seeing certainly in the US and perhaps around the world too is while there's more comfort in the regulatory system and the regulators have more comfort, there's also a greater push from patient communities and others to change the regulatory paradigm in a way that it could make it more easier to get products to market, which could be okay, or should be okay, assuming that all the standards are met. But there's also, in some cases, situations where we now have movements to try to lower FDA standards under the guise of getting products to market more quickly, but actually in a way that's going to create more regulatory problems for product developers.
Right. Is there anywhere in the world that's actually got it right at the moment?
I think some people think Japan may. They've passed some laws allowing conditional approval so that products that pass a phase 1 safety, or cell therapy products that pass phase 1 safety, and for which there is a plausible reason to believe they will be efficacious, can get 7 years of market approval. And in Japan, there's, I believe, only 3 payers nationally. Those payers are obligated to cover those therapies. So I think there's been a rush to go to Japan for a lot of cell therapy companies to take advantage of the conditional approval. But it's still a fairly regulated process. You still have to conduct a detailed phase 3 study. You still have to then file at the end of those 7 years for continual market approval. So it's not simply the Wild West where you do a phase 1 study, say we think this should work, it looks safe, and you get to stay on the market. It's still regulated, but they're trying to strike a balance between accelerating therapies, as Michael said, to get people therapies that might prove useful while still maintaining an important component of the regulatory science of making sure that data is shared with regulators so that they actually can help make decisions in the future. So I think they've tried to strike a good balance there. Right. And I know we're owned by Fujifilm now, so for us, it makes sense that as we start to think about developing therapeutics, Japan would be one of the places we'd look to start trials.
Yeah, I think it is important to know that, and Tom alluded to this, that while in Japan they are taking steps to try to get products to the market more quickly, I think all the companies that have done work in Japan would say it's still a highly rigorous evaluation by the regulatory agency. It's in no way meant to be a shortcut or short-circuiting, review. It's just that what they've done is they've really empowered their regulatory agency to be able to make decisions and grant these kinds of conditional approvals by working with the sponsor under certain conditions, such as having smaller clinical trials or other kinds of components. So those kinds of things, I think, are areas that we might see the US FDA also gravitate to, but that's different from the way some people characterize it by saying, oh, well, in Japan, you don't really have to do very much pre-market and then you can just get to the market.
So how confident are you that we'll see a harmonization of global policies around this space?
I think what we'll see is more convergence than harmonization.
Right.
Right? And the nomenclature is important because I think that harmonization is really tough when you've got different regulatory agencies and different societies and cultures and ways of doing business and expectations among sponsors and patients and physicians. But what we have seen, I think, is the regulatory agencies in Japan, the EU, and the US, for example, who always, I think, tried to work together. I think we're seeing more and more in this space. They're working with each other and trying to do things in a more uniform way, because I think everybody understands not only that businesses can move around the world, but that in fact they're trying to use data from different countries to support their applications. And so we know, for example, that the US FDA is more supportive now of using data from trials in Japan, right, in the cell therapy space to demonstrate safety and efficacy.
But I still think it's a bit of a false issue or question as to which region or country may have it right. I mean, the answer is we don't know. And we won't know until we really see a wave of approvals and commercial success in the sector. And things can change very quickly. I mean, as Michael was describing this, I mean, we know, and you've probably been hearing at this meeting and coming out of ASCO, a lot of the expectations around the cell therapy treatments for oncology, cell-based therapies there. There are a number of programs there that could be, they're in late stage development or they're at a point where I think the regulatory agencies here in the FDA could really be taking them forward to ultimate registration and approval. So we could know at the end of the year or early next year whether we're going to see the first cohort of companies with those types of products on the market. And then I think the conversation will change completely.
But isn't that actually, it rests on actually how successful those, that first generation of cell therapies is in the clinic? I mean,
but that's true anywhere.
Yeah. But there's, if you sort of think of the big bets that have been placed on cell therapy and the sort of the breathless nature that people talk about it, is there a sort of concern that the bubble might pop if the sort of say for example the CAR Ts don't quite generate the kind of results we get?
I think we're past that.
Yeah,
You think
I agree.
I think that was whatever 10 years ago, 20 years ago, where one trial doesn't work or there's an adverse event or something and the whole field gets hurt. I think we've gone through that phase, and now there's so much promising science and so much, so many folks have proven, proof of principle at least, that I think the field is mature enough that it can withstand that kind of incident.
I was going to answer it slightly differently in that I don't think there's been a big bubble of investment in cell therapy yet, save for CAR T. And there I think the reason is oncology is a hot field.
Sure.
T cells are well understood. We've been using blood transfusions for years. We know they're relatively safe. But you have not seen pharma making large investments like they did in siRNA in the cell therapy field for, say, dopaminergic neurons for Parkinson's or cardiomyocytes for AMI. That's still, we haven't been there yet. So that bubble isn't there to burst.
Right, so in fact we're still really at the early stages. We're in the foothills of this challenge.
I think companies trying to develop those therapies would tell you yes, that there's still a challenge in raising money, and that big pharma has been largely standing on the sidelines waiting to see a signal of success that convinces them it's time to rush in.
Okay, so just to sort of conclude the policy regulatory aspect of this discussion, what is the one event or action that you would like the regulators or the policymakers to take on board that would actually make a difference to the development and the enhancement of this space?
So I think, standards. So I think that one answer to that question is that for cell and gene therapies and tissue engineering products, there isn't a set of standards by which we can measure these products against. And each of these technology sectors are going to have a different set of standards. There'll be some commonality, but essentially a gene therapy product is going to be evaluated different than a tissue engineering product. And so I think what we can do as a sector is really help and support the development of standards specific to those types of products being developed and educate the regulators, provide a toolbox, here in the United States, the EU, Japan, and sort of, accelerate that convergence. But really clearly we need standards for these types of products.
There's been, I think, a fair amount of progress made in that regard. And I don't think we're necessarily suggesting that we're going to legislate standards. It's I think as Sarah was suggesting, it's really creating the environment to make sure that the standards continue to develop and that the stakeholders in the private sector and among the standards development organizations are able to work closely with the regulators to validate these standards so that they can be used.
No, I was just going to say, and I think if there were someone from FDA on this panel, they would agree that that's a significant thing that is going to happen and needs to happen for the field to advance.
So for example, in the chemical drugs space, you've got organizations, IUPAC would kind of set those standards. Who takes the lead or who is taking the lead in this space?
So so there are a number of organizations that are involved in this process, and so there's some small groups that are doing it, but There are groups like ASTM, NIST, USP. I mean, they've all been doing work in this particular area. On the international front, as we mentioned, ISO is beginning to look very, very closely at cell therapy and bioprocessing and biomanufacturing. So I think the right groups are there. But in the gene therapy space, there's an example of where there's a lot of support coming out of the academic community, and a lot of this is still really beginning to take root. And one of the things we're trying to do is provide the infrastructure to support it.
It's been fragmented.
Yeah.
You've got sets of experts that have built their translational work around certain types of assays or certain types of models, and they're very disparate right now. And so the ability to coordinate those and use them as a body of tools is critical. And I think as a number of these products are based on common pieces, for example, AAV or a common promoter system, or that there's the ability to really, sort of accelerate or utilize that commonality to be able to move, multiple products forward at the regulatory level.
Okay, so it was kind of hinted about the sort of, some sort of technical developments that we've already had. Maury, I think that you raised it, that there has been progress. Again, as we sort of look forward, what are the sort of the technical challenges that actually would allow cynics like me to be still skeptical about the space? I mean, what would be sort of the key technical development that you would sort of say, right, actually this means that actually this has now got legs and it's gonna succeed? Sarah, do you want to take a stab at that?
So I think it depends on the technology, yes, but I think it's manufacturing, and it's going to be, for example, autologous CAR T therapies are going to have is a process development that needs to happen. It needs to be industrialized. That's very different than centralized manufacturing of vector components for gene therapy products. And so there's manufacturing challenges in each of these types of products. For example, with tissue engineering products, there may be components that are derived from multiple sources that need to come together, and then this product needs to be manufactured, then further manufactured prior to delivery. And so I think it really very much depends on technology type, the type of process or manufacturing that needs to be improved and industrialized. But I think across the board we can say manufacturing.
Which is, one of the reasons why, your company was acquired by somebody who has those skills.
Right. So I think like any manufacturing process, you're always trying to optimize cost, yield, efficiency, reproducibility, and yet that's hard to do when you don't yet know what the end specification should be for the cell that you would want to develop for the clinic. So that's one challenge that's going to have to go in parallel in sort of an iterative fashion to decide what is the right specification for a dopaminergic neuron or for a cardiomyocyte. So I think those are scientific challenges that we haven't resolved yet. Again, the issue of standards is identity testing, purity testing, functional release assays. Those, again, are determined by the indication that they'll be used in. So I think there are a fair number of challenges that still have to be surmounted, but many of them require more resolution on the science side to determine what is the cell that we're trying to make and how is it going to be delivered and what the dose is going to be. That's on the practical side. As we've all been alluding to, there's the other side is payer acceptance, clinician acceptance, without knowing that there's a reimbursement formula for therapies that very well may be curative, not just palliative. That will stifle investment in this field. And companies that have, you can see there's a huge outcry about the cost of cancer drugs. I think Unicure was going to price their gene therapy at about $1 million, and you need it every 5 or 6 years. But is that justified? And you have to convince the payers, especially in the U.S. And elsewhere as well, that is a net benefit to the healthcare system. And so those are some of the challenges that are going to have to be addressed as we're also working on the technical challenges of producing the cells.
Yeah. So I was going to bring up money and pricing, but yeah, but I thought we'd leave that to the end. I thought
Can we ask you a question?
Go on.
Well, I mean, if you're going to wear a jacket like that on stage, you deserve a jacket. But but you've asked us the question of where we see the challenges still in the space, and are these surmountable? Can we address them? I mean, what do you think is the big? I mean, outside of the market access issues and money, because we'll get to that. I mean, what do you see as the main?
Okay, so thanks for that. Thanks for that, Maury. Yeah. So I do think there's been progress, and it's really interesting. I think that if you look at the sort of the development of biotechnology, historically there's always been the sort of the excitement when certain scientific challenges have been resolved, and then we have to work out actually how do you then commercialize that. And by commercialize it just doesn't mean sort of selling it or whatever, but actually industrialize the whole process. So if you think about monoclonals, okay, sort of the first generation of monoclonals, I mean, there were diagnostics and that was about it. And it took 10 years or more before we started getting products. And it's only now that the real sort of strength of those biologics is now actually having an impact. So I think that, emotionally and scientifically, it sounds like cell therapy and gene therapy. It sounds like it should work, right? So in that respect, that's it. However, right? So I'm going to switch the ball back, right? However, what I'm interested in is because of the sort of pricing reimbursement, but also sort of the manufacturing is actually. So what actually do we have to resolve first? Because do we have a situation where we have to really understand that there is a market for these products, that will people find value in these products, and will they pay for it? Because if there isn't a market, what's the point of developing the technology and the manufacturing? So do we have to get the pricing models sorted first, and then we have to sort of obviously demonstrate where the value is? Or do we actually do we get people, like Fuji or, Lonza or whoever's sort of, developing the sort of the technology, GE Healthcare, to actually get the sort of the manufacturing side resolved? So, in the sort of the chicken and egg, which is the chicken and which is the egg? Do we have to resolve the manufacturing first to actually know that we're going to be able to make these things economically?
So some of that can be handled by, and I'll use CDI as an example, is that we make cells for research purposes. So we're pretty good at making billions of cells, highly reproducible year after year after year. Now, converting that to a GMP process is not trivial, but we think for many of the cell types we make, we do know how to make them reproducibly, cost effectively at reproducible, high functioning cells. Whether those are the right cells for therapy is a different question, and that has to be addressed scientifically. But we do think that when that is resolved, we should be able to make those cells. I mean, I think we're comfortable that the manufacture of cell therapies can be done, or cells can be done in a reproducible, cost-effective fashion. But it will come down to what the dose is for a particular indication, what the durability of that treatment is, the dosing regimen. There's a lot that isn't known at this point that factors into whether this is a cost-effective therapy. One thing that I think we like to point out is that, at least in the area of tissue engineering, which I said is scaffolds and cells, you have the opportunity to replace cells that are lost to aging or disease. And that's different than a transient therapy, which you could argue maybe there are other ways to accomplish it. You lose part of your heart because you've had a myocardial infarction, or part of your brain due to Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. There is no way to restore that function without replacing those cells. So I think in those cases, the payoff would be worth it, but we're still a ways from having the definitive data to show that. So.
But isn't the issue and the challenge that at the moment, all these technologies or these approaches are down to the individual level. It's one size fits one person, not one size fits all. And what we need is a universal CAR T, for example.
Well, I think from our standpoint, we're pretty agnostic. We don't know if the best therapies will be allogeneic, autologous, allogeneic, or say some HLA super donors that match some of the key HLA loci, or some universal cell that has had its MHC or HLA antigens downregulated that could be used broadly. I used to work in pharma, and when we were out scouting cell therapy companies, we were always more interested in companies that worked allogeneically than autologously, because our model was always you make a large amount of a drug, you test a few vials, and you ship it out, versus autologous, which is every batch is another product, every patient is its own batch. That was not a model that a large pharmaceutical company find attractive. But again, I think the jury's out as to which is going to be, and I'm guessing it's not going to be one size fits all. There will not be a single approach that will be the best approach for all indications. We just have to start accumulating that data to know that. I'm comfortable for saying we can do all three. We can make autologous, we can make allogeneic, we can make HLA, we can make universal cells. To us, we don't think that's going to affect the manufacturing process. That's more of the clinical approach.
Yeah, and I think that what's going to be interesting to watch on the reimbursement side is I don't think it's going to be one size fits all there either, right? So you have a situation now where all biologics are paid a certain, right? They're all paid average sales price plus 106% of average sales price. That may not be true when we're talking about reimbursement of these kinds of biologicals. It may not be true for any biologicals 10 years from now, but it certainly may not be true for these kind because of what Tom said. They'll have different kinds of delivery, they'll have different manufacturing, they'll be so different that I think when we talk about kind of solving reimbursement or payment in this space, I think that's also a multi-dimensional question, because I don't think it's going to be, we were wondering what the answer is, here's the answer, now we finally figured it out. I think it's going to be a lot of different answers for a lot of different technologies, for different indications in different ways. So the question is going to be, which ones of those make sense? And then the question is going to be, which ones of those, even if they make sense from an academic, or let's call it academic or intellectual perspective, the next question is going to be, can they be implemented? So, for example, the reason that all biologicals are paid 106% of average sales price is because that's what the Social Security Act says, because Congress writes the law about how biologicals will be reimbursed. So, is it going to require, even if we knew how some of these various models, are they going to require us to change the law to give Medicare the authority to actually implement these kinds of payment models? Probably, and that's I think part of the analysis and the exploration we have to do.
I would just like, if I come back to, sort of the development of autologous therapies and industrialization of autologous therapies versus allogeneic or centrally manufactured vector. With autologous, there's a whole different set, there's a set of criteria and parameters that we're going to have that are different than centralized manufacture that need to be addressed in autologous, such as, information technology in and around, the handoff of the sample from needle to needle, what's going to have to happen there and industrializing that process. Very different than, some of the challenges that for example, AAV companies are facing right now in scaling manufacturing processes, whether it's a certain cell type versus another cell type versus adherent cells versus, cells in suspension. Where there are different set of challenges, for those centrally manufactured. So I think that, there are going to be, we're faced with that, and the companies bringing these to market are going to have to solicit the help of, infrastructure partners that have expertise in these areas.
So that sort of neatly segues back to to what Tom was saying, and sort of raised the question with me is that, these are sometimes described as disruptive technologies, but a true disruptive technology is something that's actually coming from left field. So, for example, in the digital health space, where everybody's talking about that as potentially disruptive, the disruptors are actually people who are not in the healthcare system at the moment. They are, the Googles or the Apples or IT companies coming or tech companies coming into this space. In cell therapy, or gene therapy, or tissue engineering, Tom mentioned it's like, well, this isn't really pharma's space. Who actually are the people do we think are going to be delivering these technologies, these approaches?
So I don't think we know the answer to that yet, ultimately. I think some of them will be the companies. I mean, I think they will be the drug developers. I think there is a role for large pharma in this space. Does it mean that there's a role for all of them? Probably not. And I think some of them, will remain on the sideline for some period of time until they do it. I think that we will see new companies created in this space around solving some of the challenges that Sarah was mentioning, especially if you're talking about autologous therapies. I mean, these are service models, logistics that involve working with a number of different stakeholders, including the medical centers and the hospitals. So this is a service model that may be very different from what we've seen in some of the other drug companies. And a lot of it may come down to how ultimately they're going to be reimbursed, which will dictate the type of corporate structure that has to be formed in order to take advantage of it. So, which part of Medicare is going to be? I mean, that's something that will inform that process as well. But I mean, we're already beginning to see conversations about that. Companies have already been formed to start looking at different ways to approach this. So it's already beginning to happen.
And I think I would just reiterate that to understand and begin to really understand the role of major medical in these types of therapeutics, in that the start of a therapy will start in the hospital and end in the hospital, but the patient may go away for a while. For example, in these autologous therapies, and there may be the need for inpatient. So I think the role of major medical centers in, for example, transplant for tissue engineering products is going to continue to rise.
So, of course, what's ironic is that 20 years ago, Rome Poulenc created or had this concept of the RPR gen cell, which was in fact, there was Rome Poulenc, but there was lots of other different players in a kind of ecosystem, and they were going to run a kind of service model where you almost like you went in and you kind of got treated, and it was in a hospital environment that this was taking place. Is that something that you think is now going to be revisited, and just Rome Poulenc or Sanofi as they are now were just 2 decades ahead of their time?
Potentially, yeah. No, I think it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a number of different groups doing this again. But look, I mean, we already, we know that there are a couple of large pharma companies again looking at this, and are they public about all the different pieces they're pulling in? Maybe that's the difference. Is they're waiting to unveil it once they think they've actually got it right. We don't know, the answer to that. But I think. I think it is going to involve some of the other stakeholders that we talked about too, including the medical centers and the hospitals, including other industrial companies that can create new businesses and opportunities themselves in and around this space.
And I would say that in the let's call it the post-Sovaldi environment that we're in, I think that the other stakeholder is the patient groups and the patients themselves, or the public generally, or as represented by policymakers, because I think that's the other pricing pressure we're going to have. So aside from figuring out all these other technical issues about reimbursement, this is all taking place in an environment where somebody develops a cure for a disease like Hep C, which has all kinds of out-of-pocket costs for patients typically, all kinds of costs to the healthcare system, which are all now going to be saved. And and there was a lot of blowback about it. And so I think that while it, as it was pointed out to me yesterday, the share price of the companies that developed that drug didn't really suffer. And of course, payers are paying, but I think it still raises this sort of question about the price of drugs and how the companies and the sponsors of these technologies are going to be able to demonstrate the value so that they'll be able to charge what they need to charge.
So it's interesting you touched Sovaldi because, of course, Sovaldi, NICE in the UK, who actually did the health technology assessment, actually saw that as a cost-effective use of NHS funds. So they actually did see the value, and they have a pretty good reputation for normally nixing products.
About 180 from the way it was perceived in the United States.
Yeah. So that then sort of the other question then that this leads on to is, okay, so is there a poster child disease or condition that actually will bust the door down, which will help cell therapy, gene therapy, tissue engineering actually resolve that sort of, how do we price this? How do we demonstrate value? Is there something that actually, is already there or could help?
I think that's really tough. I'm not sure, because you could make the argument that what you're talking about is a rare disease, right? A rare fatal disease. A rare fatal disease that affects children, right? That would be sort of the disease. But you could make the argument that has already happened, right? There's so many biotech products on the market that were for the very rare diseases, and companies charged a lot of money for those products. And payers paid it. Medicaid paid it. Private payers paid it. So will that be the model that works in cell and gene therapy? That the patient populations get stratified, and we now cure these diseases, and the products are expensive to develop, but because it cured a previously fatal disease, companies will be able to charge more, or the payer system. Jury's out, and the jury then is out, of course. Is that going to also be true for diabetes of 20 million people versus just a handful of people with a rare disease, or in oncology? I think that's a great question. I think the jury's out.
So, okay, so you guys in the biotech sector, somebody asked me, so how do you describe people in the biotech sector? And it's basically optimistic, okay? So therefore, I'm not going to ask you, how optimistic are you about the future? What I'd like to do is as a sort of concluding remarks, actually ask you, what is it that makes you optimistic, and what is it that you, over the next, when we come back this time next year, what do you think, what would you like to see happen that's going to move the dial in favor of this space? So if we kick off with you, Maury, yeah?
No, I mean, I think for a lot of people, what makes them most optimistic is the data that we're beginning to see. We have been seeing. So, if a number of these therapies continue to perform in the clinic, and ultimately we gain approvals and they're on the market, I think that's ultimately what we're trying to accomplish. And I think where we are now is the data is there, especially in a number of these indications. So oncology, we've talked about. We haven't really talked about hepatitis yet, but that's another area that's getting a lot of interest. There's a number of indications. And I think in the next 2 or 3 years, we're really going to know. I mean, we're going to begin to see this. And I think that, at the same time, as Michael was suggesting, if we can bring the best minds together, and we're doing this right now, to try and address the pricing issue, I'm confident we're going to come up with something that will work. I mean, is it going to be perfect coming out of the gates? No. But the initial pharmacoeconomic analysis suggests that this could actually work. But it's going to be a different system than we have right now. So it's going to require some changes, and it may require policy changes.
I would say that we're thinking about industrialization. I would say also data, for sure. Clinical data and readout of some of the trials that'll read out this year it's going to be critically important and pivotal for our industry. But I think the fact that there are a number of infrastructure companies that are moving into this space very aggressively, and we're talking about industrializing processes, autologous or allogeneic or a large-scale production. We're moving from manufacturing for phase 1 and 2 to manufacturing for 3 and commercial. That gives me optimism. We're talking about solving supposedly the easy problems.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I'm going to have to agree with Maury and Sarah on this and not come up with anything original. I think the reason that I'm most optimistic also is the state of the science. I mean, it's gotten to the point where if we have a hit rate that's as good as pharma has over the last 100 years, that's still going to be huge, right? That's going to be a huge number of products treating diseases and conditions and disabilities that had previously been untreatable. And the societal impact of that is going to be enormous. And as a result of that, I think we'll be able to solve some of these other questions because we'll have to. And the patients will demand it, physicians will demand it, our society will demand it. And I think that will sort of, kind of light the fire that gets everybody to figure all of this out. Because I actually think that the science is the hard part. All this other policy stuff, we can just do it and then keep going. It's the hard part.
He's really on.
One of the major reasons that I'm optimistic is for many therapies, cell-based therapies, we're talking about deriving these cells from stem cells. They're not available from live donors or from cadavers. When President Bush instituted the federal funding ban on human stem cells, or the majority, limiting it to a very limited number of stem cells, scientists were confused. Many institutions were confused. The NIH was confused. And unless you were at a very well-funded university where you had a completely separately funded lab for incubators and microscopes and water baths, people got out of embryonic stem cell research. The advent of reprogramming has allowed a lot of very smart people back into the stem cell field, and we've seen an explosion in the number of cell types that have been developed, or differentiation protocols that have been developed, the beginning of animal studies to characterize these cells. That's improved the science, as everyone has addressed here. So I think there's now momentum in using an approach that isn't likely to encounter government funding entanglements, which in the U.S. it's largely funded by the federal government. So I think for me, although let's face it, I'm somewhat biased and my company focuses on developing cells from iPS cells, we don't do it all ourselves. We in-license an awful lot of IP. We've gotten that from people who have been able to move back into the stem cell field because reprogramming avoids a lot of the controversies that embryonic stem cells will always have associated with them. That's why I'm confident that we'll make progress in the next few years. We've just allowed so many more smart people back into this field.
Okay, so well, thanks very much. So for the last 3/4 of an hour, we've heard about the sort of the progress that's been made. We've heard about some of the sort of the challenges, some that are easier, like policy and regulatory. Although, Maury, it did at least get a chuckle from you that was easy. We've seen some of the sort of the technical challenges, and some of those still exist. The challenges around the industrialization and manufacturing, which of course is pertinent for this audience, because it therefore creates a lot of opportunities for people to find some resolutions there. And then, of course, the elephant in the room is then, and how are we going to actually pay for this? Is there going to be a market? But I'd like you to thank you for the comments. I think that you've given us reason to be optimistic about what's actually happening, and I think that in the coming years we're going to be hearing a lot more about how this particular area becomes fundamental to healthcare and health treatments. So if you'd like to thank the panelists and the usual, thank you.